Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for a Tuesday, July the 20th, 2021. So we had another Christian church, burned to the ground in British Columbia. This is from Alex Dallowal, post-millennial. This happened on Monday, 3:30 a.m. in Surrey, which is where I was living until December of last year. The Surrey Fire Department confirmed Monday morning the St. George Coptic Orthodox Church, primarily frequented by those of African and Middle Eastern lineage, was lost entirely to the fire. Given that this was a Coptic church and who it was serving, it seems rather unlikely that this was done by Native Indians. Could be Antifa, perennial suspect, but then it could be people who don't like Coptic Christians, and we know who those people are. Meanwhile, this is from Jared Jager, also at the Post-Millennial. A cross that had been installed at the top of Mount Suhailam on Vancouver Island has mysteriously gone missing over the weekend. Since the 1980s, a steel cross had stood atop the mountain overlooking the Cowichan Valley. This past weekend, locals were shocked to discover that it had been chopped down, reduced to a mere stump of metal. According to the Vancouver Island Free Daily, the cross appeared to have been sheared off with a grinder or other power tool, with only a few centimeters of steel protruding from the cement base. The destruction of the cross comes at a time of ongoing church burnings, with many believing the attacks to be retribution for the Catholic Church's role in Canada's residential school system. As the Free Daily reports, North Cowichan Mayor Al Sebring acknowledged the possibility that the cross's removal could be connected to the recent onslaught of church burnings. If this was random vandalism, he said, it's bad. If it wasn't random and if it's connected to the residential school issue, to me, that's worse. Mayor Sebring urged everybody to end the vandalism and destruction, suggesting that we need to respect each other and find ways to get along. According to the Free Daily, these sentiments were echoed in a statement released by the chiefs of 9 Victoria area First Nations after the toppling of a Captain James Cook statue led to the burning of a totem pole. These acts fuel hate and inhibit the healing that is so deeply needed right now, the chief said. The disrespectful and damaging acts we have seen are not helping. They are perpetuating hurt, hate, and divide. A friend of mine brought this up to me a couple of days ago. But on the one hand, we are told that Canada's Native Indians were subjected to a genocide. On the other hand, there is the perennial complaint that the Indians were removed from their families and placed in residential schools. So my friend asked a rather obvious question, which the regime media is not asking, which is this: if our intent was to kill them, to genocide them, why did we educate them? That is to say, forced education or genocide, pick one. And in the category of supreme arrogance, this is from National News Watch, Steve Lambert. Indigenous leaders say Manitoba government must change its ways or resign. Several Indigenous leaders are calling on Manitoba's progressive Conservative government to either overhaul its approach to First Nations issues or resign. Grand Chief Garrison Setti of Manitoba Kiwatinowi, Okimakanak, which represents 26 Northern First Nations, stood alongside others on the steps of the legislature Monday as fallout continued from Premier Brian Pallister's remarks about Canadian history. Today, we are not here to topple any statues. We are here to topple a government that is racist, a government that has no place in this legislature, Setti said. Grand Chief Arlen Dumas of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs said he is tired of dealing with Pallister. I give him every opportunity to have meaningful dialogue. We bring forward meaningful solutions, which I would assume mean more money, but he'd rather talk at me, Dumas said. The Premier's office did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Pallister has faced growing discontent over remarks he made earlier this month after protesters tore down 2 statues of Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria on the legislature grounds. Pallister said destruction is not the way forward. He said people who came to Canada did not come to destroy anything, but rather to build communities, churches, and businesses. The remarks were widely condemned as downplaying the harmful effects of colonialism, colonialism being how Canada came to be, although it's pretty much forbidden to say that now. Although Pallister said afterward he never used the word colonialism, was trying to appeal for people to work together. Pallister's Indigenous Relations Minister quit her cabinet post 2 days later, and a replacement, Alan Laguimaudière, stirred up more anger by defending some of the intent behind residential schools. That prompted 2 Indigenous men to resign from provincial economic development boards. One, former Deputy Minister and Treaty Commissioner Jamie Wilson, said he could not support the government rewriting history. Again, the point of these schools was supposed to be genocidal. Why did the schools exist? Why for 100 years or so, vast efforts were made to educate Native Indians? That does not sound very genocidal to me. Some of Pallister's caucus members have also made their thoughts known. Conservation and Climate Minister Sarah Guillemard, Families Minister Rochelle Squires, and Tory backbencher Shannon Martin posted separate social media messages last week that said residential schools were designed to eliminate Indigenous culture. I will never stand behind words that add hurt to traumatized people, Guillemard posted on Twitter. Grand Chief Jerry Daniels of the Southern Chiefs Organizations, which represents 34 First Nations communities, said Monday the Pallister government has failed to address key issues such as lower Indigenous graduation rates, shorter lifespans, high rates of apprehension in the child welfare system. Oh, that is sailing close to the wind there, Chief Jerry Daniels, and a lack of recognition of treaty rights. Daniels said the government must allow Indigenous people more control over their own lives. If Pallister can't lead and his cabinet can't lead, they do need to resign. Well, if you want to know the result of Indigenous people having more control over their lives, you can visit Canada's Indian reserves, which present, for the most part, a sorry spectacle indeed. It is the height of arrogance for a people who are entirely dependent upon government largesse to start issuing ultimata. But no, we're inviting them to do so. So that's what we get. Speaking of arrogance, here's a piece in the Toronto Star on Saturday. Forget charity. If you really want to show solidarity with Indigenous people, you need to listen and follow. And this is by someone called Kofi Hope. And he looks African to me. Let's see, what does he do for a living? He's a Rhodes Scholar, never a good sign, and has a doctorate in politics from Oxford University. He is the co-founder and CEO of Monumental, a new startup focused on supporting organizations working towards an equitable recovery from COVID-19. He is an emeritus Bosefield Scholar and current adjunct professor at the University of Toronto School of Geography and Planning, Atkinson Foundation, Jane Jacobs Prize, etc., etc. In 2005, he established the Black Youth Coalition Against Violence. And how's that working out in Toronto? What on earth is someone called Kofi telling Canadians what we must do with regard to Native Indians? He writes, it's hard to identify a historic moment in real time, to pinpoint it when you're living it, yet the grief, reflection, and dialogue, again with the dialogue, that is to say, they speak, we listen. They say jump, and we ask how high. The dialogue that has followed the discoveries of Indigenous children buried at residential school sites makes it seem possible that we are in such a moment. The public response is markedly different than what happened during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Idle No More protests. What had been obscured for many now has become painfully clear. Injustices that were for too long accepted as unsolvable legacies of our colonial past have now become unacceptable issues that must be solved today. I'm afraid people, including children, who were buried, a century or more ago. How is that problem exactly going to be solved? Injustices that were for too long accepted, yes, but while the stirring of the nation's conscience is a good thing, our indigenous communities are asking for concrete actions. As a non-indigenous person, it's not my role to dictate those actions. No, but he's going to blather on anyway. Outgoing Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde, such a lot of chiefs, asked Canadians to start with learning and advocating for the TRC's 94 calls to action. A few days ago, new National Chief Roseanne Archibald spoke about the need for a national conversation on reparations. Reparations. This is from people who get, I don't know, what, $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 a year per head, plus all manner of other benefits, simply for being on the hoof. They've already got their reparations. They've already got them, but they want more. But because, of course, they do. Kofi describes himself as leader working at the intersection, why yes, of equity, social change, and cities. Oh, and he has a TEDx talk because, of course, he does. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Dan, Palcaso 88, Clownvelt, Pitsky, Anrun, Head McNeck. Thank you for that article that you sent me last week. I appreciate it. Gamion, Kontiki Roulette, Birkin Sultanov. Palcaso 88 says, I was afraid I'd miss the show tonight. Brutal thunderstorm in Ottawa earlier. You live in Ottawa? Wow. That is a strange place for Canada's capital. If you don't know Canada, Ottawa is brutally cold in winter and brutally hot in summer, plus mosquitoes. Shogun 666 says, I've been on a, what's this, Synthafrica video marathon, trying to learn the political situation. Conclusion, very, very bad. Yo Mama says the genocide myth. John Vance says Canada is a constitutional monarchy. All bills must have royal assent before laws are passed. Well, the royal assent is in the person of the Governor General. And that person, it always seems to be a woman now, is a rubber stamp. In fact, the two-fisted astronaut, who was the Governor General before the new one, she caused a great deal of trouble because, one, she didn't want to do her job, which involves like boring stuff, ribbon cutting ceremonies, visits to Somali Canadian youth clubs, that sort of thing. But it also involves signing bills. And she started, well, what's in this bill, et cetera, et cetera. No, you're just the rubber stamp. Okay, you don't actually have any power. You have, one instance of power that if the Prime Minister wants to dissolve the government, you have to agree to that. Although there was an interesting situation when Stephen Harper was Minority Prime Minister, when the opposition parties formed a coalition and they had enough seats to make a majority. That didn't happen for some reason, and the rumor is that Stephen Harper told the Governor General, who is from Haiti, of course, and the CBC, of course, that if she didn't sign it, he would fire her. That's the rumor, and I believe it. Enron says they were educated to give them hope. Okay. If you're accused of being raped, well, no, I'm not going to repeat that. Colonialism, how every country ever came to be, said Steve. John Vance said Pallister threatened arrest for any of these protesters. No, the police sat on their hands as the statues were pulled down, although Pallister, to his credit, has said that they are going to be recreated. Hello to Buddy. Birkin Sultanov says these people specialize in the double bind. Choking 666, there will be a serious famine situation in South Africa very soon. Supply lines are destroyed. Meanwhile, the SAPS are enforcing social distancing in white shops. Hello to Frothing a Fanboy. Oh, I mispronounced a Yeah, Le G Modière, soft G. Okay, thank you for that. Western Cape needs to declare independence, says Steve. Joe Ken 666, not kidding. 75,000 troops deployed for COVID, 2,000 for mass countrywide disorder. Ed McDeck says, I've been watching the slow radicalization of regular people speed up as of late. What's this? Jim N-word. That's a new name. Hello to you. Natives are perpetual victims and are learning more sophisticated ways to grift more money from the federal government. I may have mentioned this last week, but back in the 90s, I heard no less than Andrew Coyne and Preston Manning both say that one of the reasons why immigration was just so very good is that these people don't care about the Indian problem. This really irritated me at the time because the Indian problem is a serious Canadian problem. But no, the immigrants don't care about it, so it's not important. But they were wrong. What's happened is that the immigrants from the third world, particularly from China, India, and Pakistan, and such places, have formed what Eric Zemmour might call a new Molotov-Ribbentrop pact with radical Indians and Antifa. Okay, who else do we have here? I can see Kamala turning into a Winnie Mandela under the right circumstances. I'm going to be mentioning her. This is, are these the last days? Oh, Kamala Harris goes to the hospital. No, she doesn't go to the hospital. Nothing to see here. She was exposed to COVID, or she wasn't, Of course, we went through that with Hillary Clinton, who supposedly fell down and was out of action for weeks and weeks. It's pretty clear to me that she suffered a stroke, but again, the regime media decided to suppress this information. Pitsky says, Yacht Rock, KMG. I've talked about it. I quite enjoy it. Oh, Gulf Coast Prepper says, my friend Bryden told me to check you out and said you rock and have best tales. Can you shout out my friend Bryden? Hello, Bryden. And thank you for your kind words. Okay, yes. Intersectionality, the war of all against all. This is from Ely Canton Nantel at the Post Millennial. The National Council of Canadian Muslims has put forward 61 recommendations, including a national strategy to fight anti-Muslim hate and specific penalties for hate crimes ahead of this week's National Islamophobia Summit. I can hardly wait. NCCM's CEO Mustafa Farouk said that the organization came up with the recommendations after consulting with members of the Muslim community. He added that they target, nice word, every level of government. We need to see action, and we need to see it now. Or else what? Mustafa Farouk. Governments attending the summit must know that we want more than their attendance. We want to see their commitment to timelines. Over 50% of the recommendations are targeted at the federal government, including the civil service, where it aims to fight systemic Islamophobia, according to the National Post. If systemic Islamophobia existed in Canada, why would there be so many Muslims in the Canadian civil service? The group is also calling for an amendment to the criminal code so that hate crimes have specific penalties and dedicated prosecutors. The group also wants to get rid of the process whereby the Attorney General has to consent before prosecution of hate or genocide-based crimes takes place. Genocide-based crimes. The group also has recommendations for provinces, including having anti-Islamophobia curriculums in school. The organization also took aim at Quebec's Bill 21, which aims to keep the government secular. They say the Attorney General should intervene in all challenges to the bill, which prevents public services and positions of power from wearing religious symbols. If I wanted to move to Quebec and work for the office of the Crown, I would be forced to choose between either practicing my faith or my profession. I feel particularly strong about Bill 21, a law that in the year 2021 polices and regulates women's attire, religious freedom, and our freedom of expression, says Nu Saiba Al-Azam of the London Muslim Mosque. The National Summit on Islamophobia is happening after a recent deadly attack in London, Ontario, where a Muslim family was run over by a truck while out for a walk. Yes, it also happens shortly after a Toronto police officer was killed deliberately, apparently, with an automobile. But there is a court-ordered ban on all information about this man, perhaps because he has an Islamic name. And, let's talk about censorship in my country. Post-millennial, Alex Dollawell, post-millennial is invaluable for people who want, interesting news about Canada, not regime news. The RCMP said Bill C-36, a federal censorship bill, will be useful in prosecuting bloggers and Facebook subscribers. The controversial piece of legislation will see more things through to charges, said Corporal Anthony Statham of the RCMP's BC Hate Crimes team. Law enforcement has to have the ability to use the law effectively. Bill C-36, an act to amend the criminal code, threatens house arrest or $70,000 fines for any internet publisher, blogger, or social media user suspected of posting hateful content without incitement of any crime. Cabinet introduced the bill June 23rd, just minutes before Parliament adjourned for a 3-month recess. In Canada, we don't have anything regulating speech, says Statham, who adds that under Section 2 of our Charter of Rights, our freedom of expression is protected. He said there is no such thing as free speech in Canada, only freedom of expression. What a dope. What a dope. Free speech has a specific meaning. Freedom of expression means all sorts of things, such as Miley Cyrus pretending to masturbate on stage, or pornography, which is not speech, by the way. Speaking in a webinar sponsored by the federally funded Canadian Anti-Hate Network, yes, let's hear from the grassroots, from the AstroTurf organization that we fund. And guess what? They want more laws and they want less free speech. Quelle surprise. Statham noted that current Section 319 of the Criminal Code forbids public incitement of hatred by communicating statements in any public place that incite hatred against any identifiable group. The term hatred is not defined, but identifiable groups are defined under Canadian law, and they mean pretty much everyone except white people. Statham outlined that Parliament did not define what hatred is when it outlawed hate speech in 1970. The government is now proposing to add a definition of hatred under this section of the code. Now, it may come as a surprise to many Canadians, just in general, the fact that we have this section that deals with promoting hatred, but we haven't actually defined what hatred is. Why would it come as a surprise? That is the whole point. You are guilty of hatred. How exactly am I guilty of hatred? Because we say so. Bill C-36 would define hatred as, quote, the emotion that involves a detestation or vilification and that is stronger than dislike or disdain, unquote. The amendment will lead to more changes, says Statham. I think the proposal to do that is a very good thing, he said. It may seem not like a massive development in terms of dealing with the scope of everything that's been talked about here today, but it will equip law enforcement to see more things through to changes in this country. Yes, soon the RCMP, if they have their way, will be boasting about arresting 12-year-olds for mean tweets. Internet users suspected of vilification would be subject to house arrest on reasonable grounds, regardless of whether a crime occurred. Facebook content that discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offends would be exempt. I don't quite understand that last sentence. The Department of Justice in a June 23rd backgrounder document said the measures would apply to public communications by individual users on the internet, including on social media, on personal websites, and in mass emails, blog posts, online news sites, operators of websites that primarily publish their own content, and user comment sections. Yes, so just get people to go to user comment sections and say things which are against the law, and you can shut down everyone that you don't. like. Thankfully, we have a moderator on this site. And, well, the police are the enforcers of woke. Now, that's their primary job. That's what they see their primary job as. And this is from Elizabeth Thompson at the CBC. Canadian right-wing extremism increased online during the pandemic. Report warns extreme right-wing activity could rise as lockdown restrictions are lowered. Really? What does lockdown restrictions have to do with online activity? Lockdown restrictions led to a lot more online activity. So who are the right-wing extremists? And what constitutes right-wing extremism? Online activity by right-wing extremists in Canada rose last year during the pandemic, despite efforts by governments and social media companies to curb extremism and hate speech, according to a new report. The report found that right-wing extremists in Canada are being influenced by their increasingly violent counterparts in the U.S. Quote, this raises the concern that an emboldened and increasingly violent extreme right in the U.S. could help to inspire similar activity in Canada as Canadian right-wing extremists look to their U.S. counterparts for inspiration, wrote the authors of a new report from the UK-based Institute for Strategic Dialogue, set to be made public later this week. That extremism could rise as lockdown restrictions are eased, the report warns, given the possibility that the pandemic has introduced new audiences to extreme right-wing ideology. Says the report, it is possible that when lockdowns are lifted, this may correlate to rates of extreme right activity that are higher than the pre-lockdown level. Just keep saying extreme right over and over again, and that will persuade people that this is an actual problem. The report charted an increase in extreme right-wing activity in 2020 compared to what the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has found when it first looked at the problem in 2019. The pandemic has created a febrile environment for radicalization by ensuring that millions of people have spent more time online in an environment of heightened anxiety. The situation has been an easy one for extremists to capitalize on. Of course, ordering people, putting people under house arrest, arresting people from going to parks, beaches, watching cherry trees bloom, that is in no way extremism. Ordering people to wear masks, including outdoors, ordering people to stay at least 2 meters away from each other, forcing people to put goop on their hands before they enter stores, that is in no way extremism. No, 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 no. It's just common sense. So, okay, where is this extremism? Let's have some numbers. Why don't you quote from some of these groups? Why don't you give us some scary quotes? You could paraphrase, if they're too scary. In February, a month after the attack on the U.S. Capitol, Public Safety Minister Bill Blair announced that a number of ideologically motivated violent extremist groups, including the Proud Boys, were being added to Canada's list of terrorist organizations. The researchers found, however, that the group was still operating openly online. Oh, no. We identified 2 Telegram channels hosting supporters and members of the Canadian Proud Boys, which at the time of writing were still active, despite the group's designation as a terrorist entity in 2021. A terrorist entity. It's not just merely a group, it's an entity. Overall, the researchers identified 2,467 right-wing extremist accounts, which produced 3.2 million pieces of content over 2020. While those extremist accounts made up a small share of all Canadian social media accounts, they were able to generate 44 million reactions. That would be a little more than 1 per Canadian. But again, where's this definition of what counts as right-wing extremism? Some of the Canadian accounts viewed by the researchers last year posted hateful racial slurs. Others expressed anger at particular people or groups. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the government's COVID restrictions were frequent targets. Oh, so to criticize Justin Trudeau over COVID or to criticize a government lockdowns, this now counts as being extreme right-wing? Yes. On Telegram, researchers identified 17 groups focused on Canadian affairs, including 7 channels hosting white supremacist communities. What does that even mean? Please define. 7, hosting ethno-nationalist communities. Oh, so if you want to put a Telegram channel together for people of British descent, that counts as extreme right-wing radicalism? Perhaps it does. Perhaps it does. Speaking to reporters in Hamilton Tuesday, Prime Minister Trudeau said dealing with extremist activity online is a challenge. It's important for our democracies that we have a free exchange of ideas. Sure. Free opportunities for people to express themselves, but we need to make sure that we are continuing to stand strong against violence, against incitation to violence, about encouragements to hate, against hate speech itself, which are all against the law in this country. Trudeau said that Canada has to protect fundamental rights such as free speech while ensuring that Canadians are safe from persecution and violence. Well, choose one, because you only get one. And once again, I will point out that Canadian Supreme Court has ruled that truth is not a defense to accusations of hate speech. Therefore, there is no such thing as free speech in my country. And in more censorship news, this is from Aaron Wary at CBC, who's supposed to be a reporter, but essentially writes opinion pieces. It's just one side, always one side. The conversion therapy ban can still be saved if all sides want it saved. Politics should not be allowed to upend a policy that the major parties claim they support. If C6, the government bill to ban conversion therapy, dies on the order paper this summer, it'll be due to some combination of politics and circumstances. Yes, that's generally why bills die on the order paper. Politics and circumstances. But it's still possible to save the bill. Time is running quickly short. Bill C6 is a common sense piece of legislation. It's fundamentally about safety. It's fundamentally about prohibiting torture and child abuse, said Nicholas Schiavo of the advocacy group No Conversion Canada. So let's say that we have a 10-year-old girl who has decided overnight that she is actually a boy, and her parents are distressed about this, and they want to send her to a counselor, a therapist. That would be against the law under this bill. And the therapists, psychologists, counselors could be jailed under the bill. That's how draconian this is. That there can be no speech about this. If some young man or just man finds himself to be homosexually inclined and he doesn't like this and wants to talk to someone about it because he wants to stop being that way, that would become a crime. That would become a crime. Of course, Aaron O'Toole, the leader of our hilariously named Conservative Party, is in favor of this. I believe he has some sort of niggling problems with some of it, but it's not going to make any difference. Oh, and somewhat related news. Ben & Jerry's will no longer sell their ice cream in Gaza and West Bank markets because this was what everyone was waiting for, apparently. So did Unilever, which owns Ben & Jerry, did they intervene in this? Let me just check. Ben & Jerry's decision to stop sales in West Bank puts Unilever in tough spot. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Israeli PM warns Unilever of severe consequences from Ben & Jerry's decision. From Reuters, Israel warned consumer goods giant Unilever PLC on Tuesday of severe consequences from a decision by subsidiary Ben & Jerry's to stop selling ice cream in Israeli-occupied territories and urged U.S. states to invoke anti-boycott laws. The Ben & Jerry's announcement on Monday followed pro-Palestinian pressure on the South Burlington, Vermont-based company over its business in Israel and Jewish settlements in the West Bank, handled through a licensee partner since 1987. Well, I do not believe in these anti-boycott laws, which seem to me, well, to be grossly unconstitutional. I'm not a fan of BDS. Is Israel the worst country in the world? We want to boycott countries. Israel is the first one that comes to mind. I don't think so. On the other hand, I suppose, of course, the Israeli government could always decide to retaliate against Unilever, and I don't think that Unilever would like that very much at all. Unilever is where is Unilever headquartered? Well, they seem to be headquartered in the world somewhere. They're a stateless company. And let's go back to the chat. Hello to Emma Nimpton. Truebeard says, Happy International Chess Day. Gamian says, bought irreversible damage yesterday on Amazon before it is banned. Don Willis says, control the center, control all. Claire Caw says, Canada was a UK vassal state, which the British handed over to the Americans, and the Americans are now a US vassal state. It's true in some ways. There's very little business in this country which is actually owned by Canadians. The National Hockey League has been headquartered in New York City for decades now. No Canadian team has won the Stanley Cup since, 1994? You hear a lot about Tim Hortons. Americans hear a lot about Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons is run out of Brazil now. It is owned by a Brazilian hedge fund. It is in no way Canadian. Birkin Sultanov does not like Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Metal Mike says, the extreme right is as real as the insurrection, Syrian gas attacks, Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, and something I cannot mention here. Jokin666 says, oh no, no more dial soap in our illegal settlements. Yeah. Remember Lifebuoy soap? Yes, I do, actually. There was a mania for stinky soaps, stinky green soaps. Irish Spring is another example. Who else do we have in the chat? We got a lot from Clara Caw. Porn star got rough treatment at CPAC. I'm going to be talking about that later. And wow, libertarians, they just they love losing. They really have no idea what is popular. None whatsoever. Pope Francis, the first Pope Francis, and hopefully the last, is obviously not long for this world. But Pope Nasty, as he has been called pretty much from the time that he became Pope, is determined to do as much as he can before he dies to wreck what remains of the Catholic Church. Last week, this was rumored. He went ahead. The decision by Pope Benedict to make it easier, or to make it default for the so-called Tridentine Mass, or the Mass of Pope St. Pius V, to be said. Francis, he killed it. He killed it because he doesn't like it. He doesn't like it because apparently it tends to be popular amongst people who actually go to Mass. Yeah, and we can't have that, can we? There was a bill, Pope St. Pius V in 1570, called Quo Primum, promulgating the Tridentine liturgy. And let's see how it ends. Accordingly, since it would be difficult for this present pronouncement to be sent to all parts of the Christian world and simultaneously come to light everywhere, we direct that it be, as usual, posted and published at the doors of the Basilica of the Prince of the Apostles and at the Apostolic Chancery and on the street at Campo Flora. Furthermore, we direct that printed copies of the same edict, signed by a notary public and made official by an ecclesiastical dignitary, possess the same indubitable validity everywhere and in every nation, as if our manuscript were shown there. Therefore, no one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decree, and prohibition. Would anyone, however, presume to commit such an act, he should know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles, Peter and Paul. Well, as Oberon wrote years ago, who's afraid of Almighty God these days, let alone the blessed apostles, Peter and Paul? That is to say, there are other liturgies. There's the Ambrosian liturgy, say, which is centered in Milan. But Quo Primum made the so-called Tridentine liturgy, Tridentine from Trent, where the great council, counter-revolutionary council, was held in the 16th century. It made it the primary liturgy of the Catholic world, and it gave it a universal status. This was not a unilateral decision. One could go back to roughly the year 600, say, and the Mass at that time in the West would not be much different from what became known as the Tridentine Mass. Roger Watson writes on one of my favorite sites, conservativewoman.co.uk, piece called Political Popery. The last three popes have taken me from the depths of despair to a modicum of happiness and back to despair. And not the first of the liberal popes of the last century, Pope John Paul II was a sheep in wolf's clothing. He presented a conservative face to the world when it suited him, but he was a vain man and a crowd pleaser who liked to be in the spotlight. His trademark kissing the ground when arriving in different countries was an example of his showmanship. Indeed, he was an actor. Actors are vain men, and actors have a desperate need to be loved, which is a fatal flaw in a leader. And Watson continues, of course, JP2 was not liked by liberals within the church, and generally he was hated by liberals outside it. The issues of artificial contraception, abortion, and women priests plague the papacy and the church alike. What outsiders find hard to grasp is that the theology behind artificial contraception and abortion are part of Roman Catholic doctrine and not easily changed, if at all. Liberals within the church ought to know better. The all-male priesthood derives from the traditions of the church, and in the Roman Catholic Church, tradition speaks louder than doctrine or the Bible. Yes, yes, yes. Cardinal Manning said, our faith was in the world before the New Testament was written, and it is no way dependent on it. I don't know, clowns like Michael Corrin don't seem to understand this, that the New Testament is not the Quran. It is not a laundry list of rules. So, sorry about the noise. Therefore, popes cannot be judged by the extent to which they conform to the standards of this world. They can only fairly be judged by their actions within the church. JP2 was no conservative. He was a populist whose affiliation with the Polish Solidarity movement was probably unwise. The Solidarity gamble paid off, but JP2 risked the work that the then president of Poland, Wojciech Jaruzelski, had done to plow a different furrow from the Soviet Union and to allow the Roman Catholic Church, to which his beloved mother belonged, to function. It was not perfect and far from perfect for the church, but it was infinitely better than a Prague Spring-style Soviet invasion and takeover. Some of what John Paul II did within the church was shameful. A potent advocate of liberal Vatican II values, he completed the persecution of traditionalist Catholics and outlawed the Tridentine Latin Mass, except under very strict conditions. He also unleashed Opus Dei and extended its influence throughout the church, even permitting it to ordain its own priests. Opus Dei may well have the appearance of a conservative Catholic organization, but it is an alternative hierarchy with unswerving loyalty to the Pope, whoever he is and whatever he says. We had a brief respite during the papacy of Benedict XVI, who, for example, restored the right to the Tridentine Mass. But old age, ill health, and a genuine feeling that he could not cope with the magnitude of the unraveling child abuse scandals led him to resign, and so we got Pope Francis. If JP2 was a populist, this chap is a veritable attention seeker. He feigns modesty, eschewing the papal chambers and driving his own car. He presents a nightmare for his security detail, who often did not know where he is. I began to have my doubts about Francis within weeks of his election when I attended meetings of the Global Advisory Panel on the Future of Nursing in Switzerland and Puerto Rico, which were facilitated by a very able American lady. She was an atheist, a feminist, and pro-abortion. She knew I was Catholic and said her next stop was Rome. Holiday, I asked. It transpired that she was going to meet the Pope as part of an advisory group he was setting up on global health. Apparently, he phoned her himself. A man with a state and a world church to run bypasses his secretariat and makes his own phone calls. Perhaps they would refuse to issue such invitations, which are still being received. And then we find out that anti-Pope Francis is determined to canonize Robert Schuman, who, the founder of European globalism. And yes, the fast tracking of saints introduced by John Paul II, which is one of the greatest scandals in recent Catholic history. This saw the Opus Dei founder Jose Maria Escriva canonized in record time, and John Paul II himself canonized before he barely had time to settle into the Vatican catacombs. There's no strict rule about time to canonization, but it's traditionally been highly irregular to canonize within living memory, lest something untoward come to light, as indeed it has regarding Jose Maria Escriva in Maria del Carmen Tapia's excellent book, Beyond the Threshold. Escriva was a bully. His organization denies people some basic human rights and controls almost every aspect of their lives with vindictive and capricious reprisals against those who leave. Another thing about John Paul II, he loved flattery. He loved flattery. And the group, the Millionaires of Mary, as they were jokingly called, which was led by a monstrous sex pervert from Mexico, they stood very high on JP2's list of great people, great organizations, because of the constant flattery, gifts to the Pope, and particularly to his private secretary. Schuman was a Catholic, and I would not dare judge either the sincerity of his faith or any aspect of his life other than his politics. But it's hard not to conclude that Pope Francis is administering a papal one in the eye to British Brexiteers. The road to canonization proceeds via 4 steps, taking in the status of blessed after a life of heroic virtue is demonstrated. The final step of canonization normally requires at least 2 verified miracles, and it'll be interesting to see what these are. I suggest 1, the UK rejoining the EU, and 2, the UK adopting the euro. For a cultus, a saint must be worthy of a universal cultus. And a JP2 is not worthy of universal cultus because of his treatment, his decision to ignore the sex scandals in the church, and his outrageous statement that, we went to experts, and the experts told us this was a psychological problem. Well, if you do not know the difference, if you don't know what a moral problem is, if you do not understand that molesting children is a moral problem, you're barely Catholic, let alone Pope. Interesting piece on VDare by James Fulford called The Latin Mass Was and Is the Solution to the Problem, which is the vernacular. Of course, until roughly 1970, all this started to go haywire in the 1960s, with everyone coming up with their own versions of the Mass. The so-called New Mass, the Novus Ordo, was promulgated in 1970, and many of the rubrics were outrageous. The most popular rubric for the consecration itself for decades in the West, it was heretical. Yes, for you and for all. It said, no. This is universalism, and universalism is a heresy. For you and for many are the proper words. James Fulford gives a shout out to Anne Muggeridge, who is a woman that I knew a little bit. She was Malcolm Muggeridge's daughter-in-law, a delightful woman, actually. Tom Piatek writes, lots of Catholics grumble about the American bishops, but so far most American bishops are protecting the Latin Mass communities in their diocese from Pope Francis, who wants to eliminate the Latin Mass the same way the Romans eliminated Carthage. Yes, as has been pointed out by many people, the church in Germany is in schism. It is in practical schism now, because the church in Germany has effectively said, there's no difference between us and the Lutherans, so we're just going to have services together. My old friend Michael Brendan Doherty says, I honestly almost Cannot believe how good so many of these statements by the bishops are. Not at all what I would have expected. From Chronicles, the picture shows a smiling Nelson Perez, now the Archbishop of Philadelphia, next to Cardinal Burke. You see the problem, Fulford writes. Canada is officially bilingual, as is Belgium and Switzerland, 5 official languages, but Mexico has only 1. The U.S. has no official language, but if the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops decided that all masses in the U.S. were to be in English, that might be workable. But what they do instead is to have separate masses in foreign languages for each immigrant community. For example, in New York, Our Lady of Pompeii Church has separate masses in Italian, Portuguese, and Filipino. They specified that the Portuguese is of the Brazilian variety, but failed to specify which of the 120 to 187 native languages of the Philippines they're using. It's probably the official Filipino language, which is a standardized version of Tagalog, but in the Philippines, they do have Mass in the other languages. Also available in the New York list of language masses, German, French, Slovak, Polish, Hungarian, Russian, and Old Church Slavonic, but not apparently the international language of Church Latin. Finally, on this subject, from Thomas Williams at Breitbart, the former head of the Vatican's powerful doctrinal office, the CDF, has criticized Pope Francis for imposing harsh restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass while allowing progressives to deny basic tenets of the faith with impunity. In a hard-hitting essay Monday in the Catholic Thing, German Cardinal Gerhard Müller observes that Pope Francis has drastically restricted the celebration of the Latin Mass with a clear intent to condemn the extraordinary form to extinction in the long run. In his reflections on the Pope's move to impose liturgical homogeneity and punish conservative peripheries, Cardinal Müller notes that Francis ignores the religious feelings of the often young participants in the Masses, according to the Missal of Pope John XXIII, without the slightest empathy. Instead of appreciating the smell of the sheep, the shepherd here hits them hard with his crook, Müller states in reference to one of the Pope's favorite quips. The real problems for the Church in the Vatican do not come from so-called traditionalists, the Cardinal proposes, but from progressives who undermine the core of Catholic belief. A majority of German bishops and lay functionaries, he states, heretically deny church teaching on the uniqueness of redemption in Christ, the full realization of the Church of Christ in the Catholic Church, the inner essence of the Catholic liturgy as adoration of God and mediation of grace, revelation, and its presence in Scripture and apostolic tradition, the infallibility of the magisterium, the primacy of the Pope, the sacramentality of the Church, the dignity of the priesthood, the holiness and indissolubility of marriage. Here we have a threat to the unity of the Church and revealed faith reminiscent of the size of the Protestant secession from Rome in the 16th century, Müller proposes, underscoring the disproportion between the Pope's relatively modest response to the massive attacks on the unity of the Church and the harsh disciplining of the old ritual minority. It's been quite obvious from the beginning what Pope Francis wanted. He wanted to chase the traditionalists out of the Church. He wanted to make it impossible for them to hear the old Mass. He wanted to discuss them with his constant and relentless heresies. He wanted to join the sedevacantists or some group. Now, of course, if Catholics just simply stop going to Mass, and not very many of them go to Mass anymore, who is going to pay for the Catholic Church? I don't know. Maybe Pope Francis or his successor could make some sort of deal with Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg, having apparently bought the American media, I'm sure he'd like to have the Catholic Church in his pocket as well. At 5:30, I'm going to be talking about Sparks. And 2021 it's Sparks year. Yes, the new apartheid. This is from Max Fawcett, who bids fair to be the most obnoxious journalist in my country. Enough carrots. Canada needs to use the stick for COVID anti-vaxxers. These people are very fond of sticks and of people being beaten with sticks. Here we go again. with COVID-19 case counts suddenly spiking in the United States, Great Britain, and Europe, the pandemic we all hoped was behind us, yeah, sure you did, is once again showing just how resilient it can be. And this time, the culprit for its return is clear: the combination of a new variant and millions of unvaccinated people. That's not true. More vaccinated people are being diagnosed with COVID than unvaccinated now. These same people boast that, hey, yay, Canada, we've passed the United States in per capita vaccines, and yet cases are exploding. Well, what does that tell you, Max Fawcett? It's pretty obvious what it tells anyone with any intelligence, that the efficacy of the vaccines, they're plunging. They're plunging. The spread of the Delta variant has public health officials in the UK projecting as many as 100,000 new daily cases within weeks. 100,000 new daily cases within weeks. Well, then everyone in England will have had it then. Okay? So that would truly be herd immunity, would it not? Although the country's high vaccination rates mean the number of hospitalizations and deaths will be lower than previous waves. Oh, is that why? Perhaps the Delta variant is less virulent than the original strain. But they are rising, and they're rising even faster in places like Texas and Florida, where half the adult population is yet to receive the first dose. Oh, okay. So I've noticed this amongst the fanatical vaxxers, is they're now speaking of the mRNA treatments, let's call them what they are, as palliatives. Here we see this in Fawcett. Yes, 100,000 new daily cases within the weeks, although the country's high vaccination rates means the number of hospitalizations and deaths will be lower than previous waves. No. The mRNA treatments are supposed to be prophylactics, not palliatives. So if people who are vaccinated, even double vaccinated, like those 3 players from the New York Yankees last week, and British cabinet minister, if they are still getting COVID-19 after double vaccination, this tells you something profound about the vaccine. Oh, we need just about everyone over the age of 12 to get vaccinated. Why? Because these people get sick, do they, and die? That's not happening in Alberta. Boo! Where demand for second doses is falling off sharply. Oh, golly, I wonder why that might be. According to provincial health data, there are more than 500,000 people who are not eligible for their second dose but haven't gotten it yet. That's particularly worrying in a province that has one of the lowest rates of first doses in the country and counts only 51% of its population fully vaccinated. That's why it's time for the sticks. Governments can't force people to get vaccinated, of course, and that's a bridge too far anyway. Yeah, for now. But they can raise the cost of their decision to refuse the vaccine and ignore the huge volumes of scientific research indicating herd immunity is the only way to beat this virus. Oh, herd immunity from the vaccine, but not herd immunity from actually being infected with COVID. These people have lost their minds. If they want to engage in antisocial behavior, they should be deprived of the opportunity to socialize with those of us who did our duty. That's what French President Emmanuel Macron did recently. And how did that work out for President Macron? He was forced to backpedal, wasn't he? Oh, yes, Boris Johnson. Oh, Jason Kenney's talking about best summer ever in Alberta. Yes, and he is not going to facilitate or accept vaccine passports. Well, you know, if you listen to this live stream, I've had a lot of negative things to say about Jason Kenney, in particular his treatment of COVID-19, but I must applaud him for this. The carrots, after all, haven't worked. It's time to give the sticks a try. The cost of continuing to coddle or cater to vaccine skeptics is just too high, and it shouldn't fall on those of us who dutifully followed public health guidelines. What a good little boy you are, Max Fawcett. Received our vaccinations and made numerous sacrifices in order to fight the pandemic. Perhaps you should all be given medals. Yes, Kenney is clearly terrified of his rural base, which is the home of Alberta's unvaccinated population. Yes, you see, it's just absolutely wicked that these hicks from the sticks, that their vote counts just as much as Max Fawcett's. And if you go to his Twitter feed, you find all of these people chortling about the use of sticks. Oh, yes, they'll get their freedom all right. The freedom to do nothing forever. Yeah, these are the kind of people who lead us and seek to lead us. They are nasty, nasty people. Okay, so let's, it's George Costanza. George Costanza used to say, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. This is from Kevin Brunninger at CNBC. Facebook isn't killing people. Biden walks back attack over vaccine lies. Saying he meant to accuse a dozen social media platform users, not Facebook itself, of killing people. Biden added that he hopes Facebook will do more to fight the outrageous misinformation about coronavirus vaccines being spread on its platform instead of taking it personally. Yes, when you tell a company that it is literally killing people, I can't imagine why a company would take that personally. 12 people. No, 12 people cannot be responsible for the vast majority of this. Let's see. Biden said that just before making the accusation that Facebook is killing people, he had read a report that 60% of the misinformation surrounding COVID vaccines had come from just a dozen social media accounts. That is clearly untrue. What are they posting 1,000 times a day? Are they? Facebook isn't killing people. These 12 people out there are giving misinformation. Anyone listening to it is getting hurt by it. It's killing people. It's bad information. My hope is that Facebook, instead of taking it personally, that somehow I'm saying Facebook is killing people, that's exactly what you said. That they would do something about the misinformation, the outrageous misinformation about the vaccine. That's what I meant. Yeah, okay. Well, it's good to know that's what you meant. Hannah Nightingale at Post Millennial. On Tuesday, Senator Josh Hawley slammed a report that found just 12 people were responsible for a majority of COVID-19 misinformation in the group that conducted the report. According to the Center for Countering Digital Hate report, sounds legit, which was cited by the White House, the majority of misinformation and conspiracy theories surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine were reportedly spread by just 12 people, a group they call the Disinformation Dozen. I'm surprised they don't call them the Gang of 12. Just 12 anti-vaxxers are responsible for almost 2/3 of anti-vaccine content circulating on social media platforms, states the CCDH. Prove it. Prove it. How much of this so-called misinformation do you actually know? You've identified all of it? Have you? Not bloody likely. This new analysis of content posted or shared to social media over 812,000 times between February and March uncovers how a tiny group of determined anti-vaxxers is responsible for a tidal wave of disinformation and shows how platforms can fix it by enforcing their standards. This Disinformation Dozen is reportedly responsible for 65% of anti-vaccine content on both Facebook and Twitter, with up to 73% of the content coming from the group on Facebook. Included in the dozen is anti-vaccine entrepreneur Joseph Mercola, founder of the Children's Health Defense, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., osteopath physician Sherry Tenpenny, and obstetrics and gynecology physician Christiane Northrup. Posts from the group call into question mask wearing, vaccine efficacy, side effects, and spreads conspiracy theories that the vaccine makes you sterile, as well as the long-standing theory that they cause autism, amongst other theories. So if you were to repost Anthony Fauci's letters from last year saying that the masks were rubbish, would that count as misinformation? Quite possibly. Quite possibly. This is the same dark money group that tried to have the conservative Federalist deplatformed last year, and they've gone after other conservative sites as well, like Breitbart News. The Center for Countering Digital Hate is a foreign dark money group, said Josh Hawley. And yes, inside Facebook's $1.6 billion bid to save journalism. Secret deals, favored partners, and few details. This is from Antoinette Sue at The Wrap. Facebook is spreading around a lot of dollars, but critics call it a PR stunt. There aren't many companies that can say they've poured hundreds of millions of dollars into journalism in the last few years. Facebook has $600 million since 2018 and is promising another $1 billion in the next 3 years. Yes, it's definitely, we want even more centralization of journalism. Just one publisher, Facebook. That's all we need. Anything else would be misinformation. We can't have that because Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have a monopoly on the truth. And those who disagree that they have a monopoly on the truth are guilty of misinformation. QED. This is from Pia Singh at CNBC. Dr. Scott Gottlieb told CNBC Monday that social media giants are falling short of their responsibility to regulate the spread of coronavirus vaccine misinformation on their platforms. I do not think they have an affirmative responsibility here, and in some cases they're not doing it. The former FDA chief who serves on the board of COVID-19 vaccine maker Pfizer said no conflict of interest there. Gottlieb's comments came hours before President Joe Biden walked back some of his prior statement criticizing social platforms like Facebook for hosting a deadly COVID vaccine misinformation on their services. And let's see what's the latest from Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki. During Tuesday's press briefing, Psaki responded to questioning about the White House's hand and how media covers the pandemic. I've reported that there have been some high-level discussions, regular high-level discussions between White House officials and Fox News about coverage related to the pandemic and vaccines over the course of the last several weeks and months, said Philip Wegman. Can you elaborate at all in terms of what those entailed and if you guys feel like you've had an effect on the coverage of those issues? Psaki responded by stating that the White House was in contact with many, many media outlets regarding pandemic and vaccine coverage, not just Fox News. Let me first say that we've been in touch with every network and many, many media outlets about coverage of COVID-19 to make sure people have an accurate information to voice concerns when we have them. And I think you all know we're never shy when we have an issue with a story. So that's really the frame we're looking at here. When did people start talking like that? So we understand also the importance of reaching Fox's audience about the COVID-19 vaccines and their benefits. And like we are all with you here today, we are, of course, in regular contact. And we also make regular efforts to have officials out on a range of networks to talk about COVID-19. We don't see it as a partisan issue. No. Saying that Trump supporters are killing people because they're not getting vaccinated. That is in no way a partisan issue. We don't see vaccines as a political issue. Yes, getting vaccinated is the most patriotic thing you can do. Biden said that's not in any way making it a political issue. Not at all. Why would anyone think that? And, oh yes, Kamala Harris. This is from Charlie Spearing at Breitbart. White House spokesperson for Vice President Kamala Harris, Simone Sanders, was caught spreading misinformation on Monday regarding the vice president's coronavirus test. During the White House press briefing Monday afternoon, Press Secretary Jen, again, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, said that Harris had been tested for the coronavirus and that there was no detection of the coronavirus, attributing the information to the vice president's office. I think the vice president's office put out that she was tested and that there was no detection of COVID-19. But that was not what the vice president's office has said in a statement Sanders released on Saturday night. In that statement, Sanders wrote that Harris and her staff do not need to be tested after meeting with Texas state lawmakers Tuesday, even though some of them tested positive for the virus. And the question from Brian Junedef, MD, are masks about to become permanent? This is from American Thinker. Much of the world's media is spewing nothing but gloom and doom over the Chinese coronavirus, and the worst is yet to come. NBC News reader Lester Holt recently interviewed CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, When Holt asked her, "Is this becoming a worst case scenario?" she replied, "Unfortunately, no, I think things can still get worse." Is that true? Most Americans have had at least one COVID-19 vaccine, specifically 56% receiving one dose with partial immunity and 48% fully vaccinated. Of the most vulnerable over age 65 population, 79% have been fully and 89% at least partially vaccinated. The CDC estimates that about 35% of all Americans have been infected with COVID-19 over the last year, even with some overlap between those previously infected and those vaccinated. 80 to 90% of Americans have either natural or vaccination immunity to the Chinese coronavirus. Whatever happened to the basic concept of herd immunity? The media refuses to discuss it, as suddenly this basic concept of immunology is now QAnon or white supremacist conspiracy theory. The Mayo Clinic explains herd immunity occurs when a large proportion of a community, the herd, becomes immune to a disease, making the spread of disease from person to person unlikely. As a result, the whole community becomes protected, not just those who are immune. There are two main paths to herd immunity for COVID-19, infection and vaccines. Notice infection and vaccines. Why are we told that vaccination is the only path to herd immunity? Are we there yet? It depends on who you ask and when. As the New York Times notes, scientists initially estimated that 60 to 70% of the population needed to acquire resistance to the coronavirus to banish it. Now, Dr. Anthony Fauci and others are quietly shifting that number upward. Moving goalposts is Fauci's new hobby. The goalposts are shifting again for masks. Why are we going backwards with mask mandates by masking up again, despite most of the country having some degree of immunity? Well, I guess because they can. That would be the answer that I would give. And a piece on the American Minds Substack by Spencer Clavin. The lockdowns will continue until morale improves. Ever since the CDC announced its judgment that vaccinated people can congregate indoors without masks, the letter of COVID law has been loosened, but the spirit remains. Many cities and counties no longer mandate businesses to require masks. Curfews have been lifted, capacity limits erased, but the mood has not been lifted or eased. Whether we say it or not, we know in our hearts that it could all come crashing down upon our heads at any time. Like a perpetual threat, the principle of the thing remains. The principle is this: for whatever reason, without warning, and with only the most flimsy ghost of a rationale, people with power can make burdensome, demoralizing, and ruinous demands upon people without power. We are far past the point where the invocation of an emergency situation counts for anything more than a hollow gesture, a contemptuous formality. The pretense of explanation is now an empty ritual, as empty as when White House officials put on surgical masks backstage, walk to their lecterns, then take the masks off to speak. Both rulers and ruled are going through the motions now. Neither really needs an explanation why. We know our roles. We are being taught our place. This is not going to end if we just play nice enough. It will not let up once enough people are vaccinated, whatever the hell that means. The principle of the lockdown regime is not public health, and the people in charge will not let us be free once the public is healthy enough to satisfy them. The principle of it all is power. The instrument of that power is ceaseless threat of arbitrary oppression, engineered to grind the hearts and souls of ordinary Americans down to a cringing servitude. Will all continue until we reject the premise of the thing outright, until we flatly deny in principle that these unconstitutional measures have any legitimate authority over our actions or our lives. If we want to be free. Oh yes, frontline heroes. Remember the frontline heroes? We heard so much about them. We owe them so much. This is from Alex Dallowell at Post Millennial. A Quebec nurse testified Wednesday that the Sainte-Dorothée long-term care facility administered morphine to elderly residents rather than attempt to prolong the lives of those with suspected COVID-19. They didn't all die, but most did, said Sylvie Morin, the former assistant chief nurse at Sainte-Dorothée, a long-term care facility where over 100 residents perished during the pandemic's first wave in 2020. The Globe and Mail reports that officials made it harder to treat residents and to send them to the hospital, according to a coroner's inquest. Staff put residents on the respiratory distress protocol to ease breathing troubles that unintentionally put them to death. Morant clarified that the protocol is not what kills the person, but makes them more comfortable. But with COVID, it was going so fast, I'd never seen deaths happen so quickly, she said. The person had symptoms. We tested, and we got the results 24 to 48 hours later. A day later, they were dead. It wasn't long. Well, yes, we saw a similar thing in New York State. Of course, respirators were involved there as well. The Frontline heroes decided that they didn't want any trouble from these oldsters, so they doped them up so completely that they died of morphine overdoses. From William Briggs, statistician to the stars. How many died of traffic fatalities last week? About 744. This would be in the United States on average, given 38,680 died last year. How many died of the doom? The CDC says 163. But that's an undercount due to government quitting every day at 5 or before. The real number is probably closer to the traffic fatalities and maybe, given late counts, a bit higher. We'll see in a few weeks. Car deaths are preventable and catchy too. Guy driving down the middle of the road has a heart attack, slaughters a family of 5. It happens. We could lock down the highways now. Hey, if it just saves one life, right? Right? The dreaded Delta rises. So, not knowing how to react in any other way, our experts and rulers, with full approval by the easily addled majority, are once again panicking and insisting all panic with them. With panic comes overreaction, such as reinstituting mask mandates and forms of locking down. Now, these measures haven't worked at all anywhere they've been tried, but experts, relying on their theories, say they should work. Therefore, they conclude they do work. Now, the dreaded Delta has been roaming through the UK for 1 to 2 months, according to the hyperventilating headlines. Case numbers are bumping up. More on that in a minute. Let's look first at the Delta's destructive power. In days of yore, when scientists remembered about viruses, they knew that bugs like the corona doom would mutate into less virulent, but possibly more catching forms, like the DD appears to have done. Those readers who have been here since the beginning know that testing is driving the case-demic. The greater the number of tests, the more marginal and even false infections will be turned up. These positive tests, everybody, even those who know better, call cases to make them sound scarier than they are. Unethical, yes, but useful in juicing panics. Here's one would-be public servant saying that he is testing daily. USA testing was down around 500,000 daily and falling fast when the dreaded Delta variant struck. It jumped almost immediately to 1.5 million daily, a whole million extra, and it's also going up. Also, France, whose ruler insists that all carry a paper around with them everywhere at all times and for the rest of their lives, saying they got the vaccine with it. No man may buy or sell. Anyway, we're back to the purposeful juicing of data. We now have to suspect whether attributed deaths are dying with or dying of. Again, this means we have to look at total all-cause death numbers. If these are more than we'd expect, then there's some concern. If not, and so far there is no evidence, then the panic is a bust. And we know how this story works out. It was Freedom Day, allegedly, in England and Wales, or just England, I suppose, yesterday. Wales, you still need masks. I saw some official government notification. I'm half Welsh by birth, and it is shameful to me that the Welsh have decided to revel in being such cowards. Paul Joseph Watson writes in Summit News, on the occasion labeled Freedom Day, the UK government announced that vaccine passports would be mandatory to enter so-called crowded venues from the end of September. Gee, I feel so free. After initially denying that domestic vaccine passports would ever be introduced, Boris Johnson's government feverishly set about creating the framework for them. We know from Dominic Cummings, that the angriest man in England, that Boris Johnson was talking at the beginning that, wait a minute, men are dying at 81 and women are dying at 85, and that is beyond average lifespan. And he joked, get COVID and live longer. So Boris Johnson knows the score. He's just too cowardly to act on it. I'm going to be talking about Tom Bauer's biography of Boris Johnson on Friday, and it's just an extraordinary life story. You know, C.S. Lewis pointed out that one of the problems with reading biographies is that there's a tendency to look at, to understand or realize, discover the wickedness of great men, and then to think, well, I may be bad, but I'm not as bad as that fellow. And I certainly had that, I'm having that feeling reading Bauer's biography. According to the Associated Press, a French Holocaust survivor has denounced anti-vaccination protesters comparing themselves to Jews who were persecuted by Nazi Germany during World War II. French officials and anti-racism groups joined the 94-year-old in expressing indignation as more than 100,000 people marched around France against government vaccine rules. On Saturday, some demonstrators wore yellow stars, recalling the ones the Nazis forced Jews to wear. Other demonstrators carried signs evoking the Auschwitz death camp or South Africa's apartheid regime, claiming the French government was unfairly mistreating them with its anti-pandemic measures. And let us go to Lockdown Skeptics, which has been renamed dailyskeptic.org. That is skeptic with a C. Freedom of speech is under attack. According to GB News, barrister and libertarian Francis Hoare is the man behind a 50-page report by Lawrence Fox's Reclaim, a party demanding free speech be enshrined in UK law. Border officials told to stop checking test status of people arriving in England from green and amber countries. Vaccine passport checks could be introduced at football grounds. The loneliness of herds, and I'm looking at a very sad picture here with the flat art. They call that Memphis art. Happy to chat bench. Sit here if you are happy for somebody to stop and say hello. Yeah. And there's one of those little scanning devices there on it. We're publishing an original piece on the Daily Skeptic today by Dr. Sinead Murphy, a research associate in philosophy at Newcastle University and a regular contributor. She starts by teasing out the implications of a new bench on St. Thomas Street in Newcastle, which advertises itself as being for people who are happy to chat, and from there draws some gloomy conclusions about the gradual elimination of spontaneous, unsignposted social interaction. Has the person sitting on the happy to chat bench sat there on purpose to chat, and are they completely indiscriminate about whom they chat to? Did they see the sign before they slumped onto the seat? If they are sitting on the section of the bench with the sign posted to it, then they are at least partially obscuring the sign from the view of passersby. Does that mean they prefer not to chat to complete strangers? Thank you very much. The difficulties abound. The irony is that we are much more sure of ourselves in implicit humor interactions than we are in explicit, centrally administered interactions. And there is a vaccine safety update at dailyskeptic.org. I have to be very careful about what I say about this. I will just alert you to it. Figures show that more than 1 million English pupils were out of school for COVID-related reasons last week. 774,000 of these were self-isolating after having come into contact with another pupil at school who tested positive for the virus. Yes, that our smartphones have become instruments of oppression. Oh my God, the dreaded ping. Run, run, run as fast as your little legs will carry you. Run home to safety. Yes, get COVID, live longer, joked Boris, according to Cummings. Minister refuses to rule out forcing pubs to check vaccine passports. Lancet paper overestimates number of complications associated with COVID-19 hospital patients. And yes, who was it? Javid, is that his name? Cabinet minister, who announced that he had COVID-19. And but no, he wasn't feeling all that badly, and that was because of mRNA treatment. And once again, I have to wonder, is he really that stupid, or does he believe that we are that stupid? Because the mRNA treatment is not a palliative. Lancet study shows real-world patients are up to 400% more likely to suffer adverse events than drug trials show. Man calls for introduction of armbands that show wearer has weakened immune system and would like to keep distance. COVID-19 mortality rate among children is even lower than previously thought. This is from the New England Journal of Medicine. And all UK children could be offered COVID vaccines by the end of the year. And as always, we go to Alex Berenson to wrap up this segment. If you had told me back in March of last year that in July of the next year, I would still be talking about COVID-19 and people would still be wearing masks and the vaccines are here, but apparently the social distancing and the masking must continue, and more lockdowns, I would have thought, no, that can't happen. The world has gone insane if that happens. But, here we are. It isn't over until they say it's over, so we need to make them, Alex Berenson wrote on Substack. I realized something this morning. I am sick to death of COVID, not from COVID, of COVID. You probably are too. Let's be honest, totally honest. If the media hadn't been in a frenzy the last 18 months, would those of us who aren't frontline medical workers have any idea COVID even existed? Not one of our fears of February 2020 have come to pass. No mass burials, no food shortages, no one dying in the streets. Hospitals have been open and able to treat everyone who arrives at the doors with COVID or without. Do you know one person who died or became seriously ill? Are you even heard second or third hand of a person who is not over 75 or already seriously ill or morbidly obese who died? As you may know, my own father died of COVID, with COVID. In any event, he was 89 years old. He suffered from very serious dementia and other serious comorbidities, as they say. Let's see. Chief Health Officer Dr. Kerry Chant confirmed the death of the woman who she said was aged in her 50s. She urged those in the lockdown area not to strike up conversations unnecessarily, using the example of seeing a neighbor at the supermarket as a time not to chat. Berenson says, my new Substack about the dangerous game the public health mandarins are playing. And Berenson continues to appear on Fox News to the fury of many. Jason Tatum is an NBA superstar who averaged 41 points and 7 rebounds in the last 3 games he played this year and is now on the U.S. Olympic team. If he's the poster child for long COVID, give me some of that. Counterculture representative had tweeted, Berenson is literally running a deliberate con, and Berenson responded quite reasonably, I'm literally not very good at it, since I literally give away practically everything I write. 14 diseases we've controlled thanks to vaccines: polio, tetanus, measles, influenza, hepatitis B, hepatitis A, rubella, HIV, whooping cough, pneumococcal disease, rotavirus, mumps, chickenpox, diphtheria. Let's add COVID-19 to the list. Berenson responds, we've controlled influenza and hepatitis and chickenpox and rotavirus thanks to vaccines. Someone forgot to tell them. Hi, Alex. In the most recent summary published on the MOH Telegram account, there is no longer a breakdown of hospital admissions by vaccination status. I wonder why they've stopped. And Berenson comments, making bad facts disappear the easy way. Yes, Israel is still putting out cumulative figures for severe illness, though. The new update shows 42 fully vaccinated and severely ill, up from 37 on Saturday, and 20 unvaccinated, which doesn't always mean no doses, down from 24. So vaccinated people are up to 68% of all cases in Israel. Yes. At American Greatness, Ben Boychuk, the conservative case for hardcore porn. Don't be ridiculous, there isn't one, but you wouldn't know it from the recent kerfuffle over a porn star's ejection from a Turning Point USA event. The conservative case for pornography is precisely the same as the conservative case for transgenderism or the conservative case for crack cocaine. It's nonsense, a lame joke, but that hasn't stopped a host of Twitter pundits, activists, and conservative influencers for doing their damnedest to vindicate smut and its peddlers, such as the state of the conservative movement and conservative thinking. Forgive the sneer quotes, but how is a sane person supposed to respond to the online conservative simping for Brandy Love? Yeah. For that woman, she's 48 years old and wasn't very good looking to begin with. Maybe it's the idea of having sex for money, which excites a certain people. Turning Point USA hosted a student conference in Tampa, Florida this past weekend. Love, a 48-year-old porn actress, real name Tracy Lynn Livermore, and author of Getting Wild Sex from Your Conservative Woman, purchased VIP tickets for the event. When some attendees began to complain in person and online, TPUSA revoked her passes and asked her and her husband to leave. Good for Charlie Kirk for correcting an error and making clear that pornography has no place in the conservative movement, such as it is. Yeah, I'm disappointed that TPUSA kicked out Brandy Love for no reason whatsoever, tweeted the Federalist editor-in-chief, Ben Domenech, who has published some of Livermore's commentaries. She's a Florida, in fact, North Carolina conservative, sort of businesswoman who loves America. The right has an opportunity to be the big tent party. Don't be a bunch of prudes. Well, it's my understanding that everyone in the pornography industry has herpes. So I guess this big tent party that Ben Domenech would like to have would be a big herpes party. This isn't about prudery. Pornography is a uniquely malevolent business that damages and exploits men and women. It debases sex and ruins relationships. Domenech knows this, or at least he seemed to know it in 2019, but either he did not see or else refused to consider a viable political or legal solution. Referring to the trouble with regulating pornography within the current legal landscape, he tweeted, "This is another example where social conservatives should work to reestablish cultural stigmas, which are far more powerful and enduring than government regulation." That's a perfectly comprehensible libertarian assertion. In the simplest terms, regulating or banning porn would require more government. More government is bad. Therefore, regulating or banning porn is bad. As I say, perfectly comprehensible point of view, but mistaken. Domenech also contended, you're not going to ban porn online, so good luck storming that castle. Right and wrong, it's a political question. I'll come back to that too. Well, as far as libertarians go, a lot of them associated with, say, Reason, including Nick Gillespie, take the John Stuart Mill view that social sanctions are as bad or even worse than legal sanctions. And of course, Domenech's position, which is, what fiscally conservative, except they're not fiscally conservative anymore, and socially liberal, about 1 to 3% of Americans believe in that. But that does not stop the libertarians from believing that one day, libertarianism is going to catch on fire, rather like, reggae music or other things, ostrich burgers. We're all going to be eating ostrich burgers soon enough. Let's go to the chat. Okay. Talking about heresy here. Truth is a social construct, says Bob Paxson. Charlie Don't Surf, says Don Willis. It's not about transcendent truth, Gandalf, says Yo Mama. It removes God from the center of things and replaces it with man. Okay. Brazilians win the gold in surfing, says Bob Saxon. I own a small amount. What is this, of Bitcoin? The chart looks terrible. The sentiment is quite poor. I'd like to see evidence of a bottom. I don't know whether that is, in fact, yeah, it is Bitcoin. Okay, in response to half Galician. Alex Large says, Berenson is a tedious bore who spreads nonsense which medical illiterates glom onto in service of their political positions. On the contrary, Berenson is a hero. He's one of the greatest living men in the United States of America. He has stood for the truth against hysteria right from the very beginning. Oh, yes, briefly, Sports Illustrated, what they've come up with 3 covers. Naomi Osaka, and I don't want to see her in a mostly transparent bathing suit. Megan the Stallion, and someone called Elena Bloom, who is a trans person. This is a serious attack on their own brand. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue is bought by men who leaf through it and drool over the woman and say things like hubba hubba, oh baby. If you are forcing them to think when they look at someone presenting as a woman, is that really a man? They are not going to buy the issue anymore. And let's talk about Sparks. Sparks is an American band which was founded in when? 1971, I suppose you could say. It's 2 brothers. Ron, the older brother, who was born in 1945. So he's coming up to his 76th birthday. And Russell, who was born in 1948. So he's 3 years younger, coming up to 73. And they seem indefatigable. I have read lots of reviews, a bunch of profiles, and a biography, which came out about 10 years ago by Daryl Easley, which you can find for free on the internet, called Talent is an Asset, the Story of Sparks. Why has Sparks lasted so long? Particularly in the absence of what one might call mainstream success? Well, it appears that they are abstemious, that they don't smoke, they don't drink, they don't take drugs. They like food, but they don't seem to eat very much of it. They are both really quite thin. They are from Pacific Palisades, California. Nice Jewish boys, although there is some controversy about that. Some years ago, Russell Mael was asked about this in an interview, and he said, my mother is Jewish and I am not. Now, there are always people that are going to go on the internet and chase this thing down, and I have seen someone attempting to prove, based on U.S. Census records, that the male boys are Jewish on both sides of their family. It's not of any particular interest to me, although I will point out that their mother, Miriam, she had a pseudonym that she used when she was the head of their fan club. And when they moved to England, she moved to England with their stepfather. Their actual father died when they were about 10 years old, I believe. And they say there's nothing like a mother's love, and it is true. There are very few people who are successful in this world that do not have a loving mother. And the Sparks Boys were lucky enough to have this. You know, amusingly, you can see them during the big TNT show as a part of the audience. And who was in there? Oh, lots of famous people at the time: Ray Charles, Petula Clark, The Loving Spoonful, Bo Diddley, Joan Baez. There was this fashion for concert films, live concert films, in the 1960s. They both went to university, to UCLA, studying art and filmmaking, and they've had obviously a great love of film throughout their lives, and now they've made one. Well, they have written the script for one called Annette, directed by Leos Carax, which premiered on the opening night of this year's Cannes Film Festival. Apparently, it was quite a controversial film, which, as I say, I like to hear it. If I hear that everyone likes some film, I'm thinking, yeah, this sounds like Oscar bait. It sounds dreary. The Sparks Boys have been making records for a very long time. Their first recordings were made in 1967. And they formed a band called Half Nelson. And the record company, after the failure of the first record under that title, the record company, which was Bearsville, which was owned by Albert Grossman of Bob Dylan fame, they forced them to change the name. And as Half Nelson was, too weird, too obscure, too wrestling, as Ron Mail said in the liner notes. And so, what do you got for us, the Sparks Brothers? This was not greeted with much fervor. See, there's two of you, and it's kind of like the the Marx Brothers, only there's two of you, and you're brothers, the Sparks Brothers. Get it? Because you're so quirky. And the band at that time said, okay, how about just Sparks? Ron Mail wrote some years later that he thought about this, and it often happens that a band is initially unsuccessful and the record company says, oh, you have to change everything about what you do. You have to bring in co-writers and all that. Wouldn't it be better if bands just changed their names and tried again? Todd Rundgren, the legendary musician and producer, was closely associated with Albert Grossman, and Rundgren was picked as the producer for the first Sparks album, which is eponymous, as they say. And there were two members of the band who later went on to some success in the music industry. Earl Mankey on guitar, who became a very prominent producer and engineer, and his brother. So you had two sets of brothers in the band, Jim or James Mankey, who was in a band called Concrete Blonde. And you had a fellow called Harley Feinstein on drums. I like the second album much, much better, a Woofer in Tweeter's Clothing, which was produced by Jim or Thaddeus James Lowe, who was in a band called the Electric Prunes. I had Too Much to Dream last night fame, and he had worked very closely as Todd Rundgren's engineer, and he liked the band. And he took over production for the second album, which came out on Bearsville, and it begins with a tremendous song called Girl from Germany, which is about a young man who brings home to meet his parents a girl from Germany who freak out because, the war. They just can't get over the war. And they just see, Hitler in their paneled wooden den and such like. And it's a very strange record. Perhaps stranger than any of the records that they've made since. There's a song in it called Here Comes Bob, which came out about the same time, before J.G. Ballard's Crash. And it's about a man who crashes his car into other people. Not just cars, trains, such like, because he's desperate to meet people. And there is as the kids like to say, banging version of Do Re Mi by Rodgers and Hammerstein from The Sound of Music. And it's a delightful record. It did not sell very well. Sparks, they went to England where they had a residency at one of the most famous nightclubs there. And Island Records decided to sign them. The residency was at the famous Marquee Club. And the Sparks Brothers had always been, well, Anglophiles. You can tell that in their music. The type of stuff that they liked most, the Kinks, the Small Faces, but more obscure groups like The Move as well, which was a huge hit band in Britain, but went nowhere in the United States. And they put together a powerhouse band, Sturm und Drang, you'd say. And Adrian Fisher and Norman Dinky Diamond, Martin Gordon, who played, a Rickenbacker bass guitar, which was a matter of contention because Rickenbacker guitars are associated with musos. They have a very particular sound, and the band insisted that he play a Fender, and then they kicked him out of the band because he had ideas. He was a songwriter himself, and he later did some very nice stuff with groups like Jet. But the other American members of the band had been left behind in California because of visa problems. That may be, convenient, I suppose. So they hired 3 Englishmen, and they had a huge hit called "This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us," which was produced by Muff Winwood, who played bass in the Spencer Davis group, and of course is the older brother of his much more famous Winwood, Steve Winwood. And this song went to number 2. And there's a legend associated with this record, which they probably made up themselves. That the story goes that John Lennon was watching Top of the Pops, and he saw Sparks doing "This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us," and then he swore and said, "Hitler's on telly." Because at that time, Ron Mayle had rather kind of a Jewfro, I suppose you could call it, and a toothbrush mustache. He would say this is a Charlie Chaplin mustache, and other people would say that it was Hitler mustache. And so he was forced to abandon that, and he switched to the caterpillar mustache. Sparks were always a high-energy band. Russell jumping up and down, singing in falsetto, whereas Ron, so it's not much mobility from him. He sat at his keyboard and showed no facial expression whatsoever, which became part of the shtick about Sparks. It's one of the things that people love. Let's see, what else? There was a rumor that their mother was Doris Day. All sorts of rumors like this. I like these stories because, you make up something like that, and by the time it gets disproved or whatever, it's already gone around the world, and it just, it amuses people. Their third record, their first on Island, was called "Kimono My House," which, of course, is a pun based on a hit song of the 1940s, was it? It has 2 Japanese girls in traditional costumes on the cover, and it has delightful songs, many of which are strange, such as Amateur Hour, which was a top 10 hit and is surely the only top 10 hit in Britain to name check Yehudi Menuhin. Talent is an Asset is about a young Albert Einstein and how his parents want the very best for him, but they also want him to have time for lots of girls as well. You have Here in Heaven, which is a strange song about a murder-suicide in which a double suicide in which one of them didn't go through. So you have one of them, on Earth and another one not, and distraught at the separation. This, again, absolutely delightful album, but perhaps, of the first of their island records, the one that I like the best is Propaganda, which is kind of absolutely crazy, just in its intensity. And there's a lot of songs about sex, sexually voracious women, and Thanks But No Thanks. A lot of songs about being a child from Sparks. Thanks But No Thanks is about a boy who wants to talk to adults, but he's been terrified that no, you must stay away from people taller than you because they all represent a physical threat to you. And the boy thinks that it is very sad. Very unusual for a band to make an album like Indiscreet, which was produced by Tony Visconti of David Bowie and T-Rex and Morrissey fame. And Tony Visconti liked to experiment. And there's a song, one of the singles, Get in the Swing and Looks. They sound like the Andrews Sisters, which is not the sort of thing that one would expect from a rock band in 1975. The Sparks Boys, they were a teen sensation. Well, maybe preteen sensation. They were on the covers of all the magazines, and they were screaming, fainting girls and such like at their concerts. But in those days, that sort of popularity typically didn't last for very long because the record buying populace was looking for something novel, and Sparks was no longer novel, so they returned to the United States and made a record called Big Beat, which was produced by Rupert Holmes, and then introducing Sparks. And you just see what they're on Columbia Records. They were on Bearsville, and then Island, and then Columbia. And the number of bands that Sparks, the number of record labels that Sparks has been on, let's see how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. That must be something close to a record. Sparks is a band that liked to do new things, not to get caught in making the same record every year. And they were great admirers of the Italian-German producer Giorgio Moroder, particularly her work with Donna Summer. And so they decided they wanted to work with him, and they made a record that came out in 1978 called The Number One in Heaven, which is one of the most influential records in recent decades. Because, everybody hates disco, right? Well, I suppose Number One in Heaven is where disco begins to be defined as club music, rather more sophisticated. And Number One in Heaven, big in France. Sparks is one of those groups that was at one point big in Britain, and then big in France, and then big in Germany. And they moved from country to country. And eventually they became big in Britain again, just in the last few years, which is really remarkable, that so many decades could go by before, without having a hit. And they continued to make records, some better than others. But come on, you got to love a record and a song called Angst in My Pants. That is just so good. And they made a record in 1983 called In Outer Space, which actually had a song called Cool Places in it, which was kind of an American hit. They did a duet with Jane Wiedlin of the Go-Go's. For the longest time, Sparks was attempting to have a film made with a Taiwanese filmmaker, and they wasted years and years and years on this. And with Russell Mael saying that, in effect, to his horror, he discovered that Hollywood was even scummier than the music business. If you read the biography that I mentioned before, that there's a lot of criticism of the male brothers. What, for their alleged selfishness, for, I suppose, speaking out, making demands. And I've read so many biographies of bands who've just been screwed over totally, that if you are not advocating for yourself, then can you really expect others to advocate for you? Again, the survival of Sparks over so many years, it is really, really remarkable. Really, really remarkable indeed. Sparks made a big comeback in 2002 with a record called Lil Beethoven, which begins with a song called The Rhythm Thief. Say goodbye to the beat. And they decided to move away from the the tyranny of the beat, and largely leave it out of their songs and move to what you might call electro orchestral arrangements, or just a song called My Baby's Taking Me Home, which the lyrics of which are the title repeated something like about 104 times. And there is a spoken word part of this. They made a concert film live in Stockholm in 2004, which I highly recommend. And it just goes to show, as David Byrne once said, that ideas don't cost anything. They didn't have a lot of money to work with, but they made their own visuals, and the presentation on stage, making maximum use of Russell's hyperactivity and Ron's lack of same, and bringing out Ron to give voiceovers for songs. In the concert, there's just 4 musicians there, and they're obviously using, backing tapes, but it's all integrated seamlessly. And if you look at the track list, that they do the whole of the Lil Beethoven record, and then another second concert of 20 songs or something like that. It's just absolutely a punishing regime. Later, a couple of years after that, they performed every single one of their albums, over 20, on near consecutive nights in a theater in London. Again, apparently clean living has its advantages. So, coming up to the present, as I say, the last 2 Sparks records have reached the top 10 in Britain. And again, of course, records don't sell as much as they used to, but both Hippopotamus and A Steady Drip, 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 both a top 10. Before that, they had done a co-production with Swedish Radio, which is an original radio play with music called The Seduction of Ingmar Bergman, which is based on the idea, what if Hollywood had been determined to drag Bergman to America? And so in 2021, we have a new record from Sparks, which is a soundtrack for the film that they wrote for Leos Carax called Inet. And it stars Adam Driver and Marion Cotillard. Pretty good people to have in your film, I must say. And there is, of course, the documentary. Oh, I should mention that they did a collaborative album with Franz Ferdinand in 2015, which was a mild success. Sparks is one of those bands that it's someone's saying, I think Beck says in Edgar Wright's documentary, The Sparks Brothers, that, if you're on a tour bus, that eventually someone is going to start speaking about Sparks and how influential they've been. A lot of musicians love Sparks, and I think one of the reasons they love Sparks is because they rather envy them. Not their relative lack of the success, but doing whatever the hell you want to do and not worrying about the consequences is very appealing to members of bands, particularly these days. Where would you start if you wanted to investigate Sparks? Well, let's see. Let's look at some of the compilations. The two originals of Sparks, I don't know whether that's available anymore, but there's a Best of Sparks that came out in 1978, Island Records. The Rhino collection from 1991, Profile, is quite good. But no, a compilation of the Island stuff is definitely good. And if you wanted to start with the more recent stuff, I would say Lil Beethoven. I would also mention a record that they made where they traded on, how much they're loved by other bands, which came out in 1997, called Plagiarism, where they do new versions of many of their most famous songs. And there's two versions of This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us, and one of them is with the metal band Faith No More. And another one, there's no guitars at all, and there's no drums and no bass. It is, probably a string sextet arranged by Tony Visconti, and it is absolutely stunning. So those are my thoughts on Sparks. KMG should review Zappa's 200 Motels. I cannot bear Frank Zappa. I really cannot bear Frank Zappa. Glib Medley says, I must admit I bought Chris Gow's compilation book. Can't recall which bands he turned me on to, but I was looking for stuff that wasn't on radio, and it was hard to get info out in the sticks. I used to feel that way when I saw Chris Gow's his column, with the short reviews that appeared in Cream magazine. I guess they were originally in the Village Voice. He introduced me to a whole bunch of people that I'd never heard of. And, back in those days, buying LPs, it was something of a magical mystery tour. And, LPs were expensive. So you didn't want to buy something that you weren't going to like. So if someone you trusted said that a record was good, you bought it on that basis. Visionary Companion says Chris Gow was one of those critics who benefited from the new dispensation, allowing tone-deaf people to opine about music. Chris Gow does not like Sparks. In fact, it's pretty clear he does not like Europeans. Of course, there's the exception made for the Rolling Stones, about who he never stops going on about. But, of course, the Rolling Stones stuff in the 60s and early 70s is peerless. Oh, yes, and Chris Gow. What does he call himself? The dean of rock critics, dean of American rock critics. He's kind of pompous, but I learned a lot from him. Jim Smith says Sparks has never had any American hits to speak of, at least compared to the success they had in England. I don't know, they were on Saturday Night Live a couple of times. But again, I don't know, people say bad things about the 70s. There was a lot of weirdness and a lot of experimentation in the 1970s, and you don't see that much anymore. And for that reason, I have fond memories musically of the 1970s. Glib Medley says Sparks didn't get much FM airplay when I was growing up. I can't recall ever hearing them before their quintessential 80s dance hit with Jane Wiedlin, Cool Places. Visionary Companion says Chris Gow has a lot of gall to blither about Sparks being women haters. He likes to boast about his advocacy for hip-hop and seems to have no problem with the feral grunting misogyny of that idiom. Yeah, well, you see the problem there, right? Look, Ron Mael has written a lot of songs about women. Ron Mael is, let's say, he's a master of irony. I don't see any evidence that, to write a song about a woman who's sexually voracious at home, at work, at play, or to write about a song about a woman who is greedy for material things, something for the girl with everything, who's going to assume that these songs condemn all women? Woofer is my favorite Sparks album, says Jim Smith. Glib Medley says, I saw Sparks at a free concert in Central Park, New York City in 2002. Fun show. Apparently they will return to Central Park in August on their Lil Beethoven tour. Okay. So Bob Paxson says, Jewish Mothers Rock. Okay, so that is the show for today. I'm going to be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show, any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you'd click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which I could honestly very much use right now, specifically, in the next few days, because I have another month coming up that I have to pay for. My PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.